Hey everybody, this is Malagos from starsystemdb.com and the ship and component spreadsheets. Today I'm going to talk about both of these resources and how to use them. So back in point 8 and point 9, in the early days of Starsys, and at least the playable versions of it, if you wanted to know how much damage a weapon did, or how fast it shot, that data wasn't available on the website or really in the game, and even today it's not. Um, so to test, players literally, I mean, at the time had to buy with cash in Voyager Direct the weapons, get a friend, go into the game, and then record everything in slow motion. And of course, you got to remember back in those days, it took like 5 minutes to load up AC. Um, then you would go back and watch the video frame by frame and just count it. That was, clearly insane. Just a hilariously terrible way of testing the game. So starting in point 9, I kind of realized that I could be extracting the data right out of the game files. Initially, I shared that information in a Google Sheet, and really I still am today. But more recently, I started to put the data into a primitive web app, even though I'm not really a web developer. I'm pretty good at scripting. So the purpose here is to allow players to know what they're testing. Why ship A seems so hard to kill, for example. I mean, you could go in and look at the armor values and see that, well, it actually has armor while other ships don't. Or maybe its shield has a recharge 10 times faster than other ships. Or maybe its jerk values are still from an older version of the game where there was a different flight model. Every one of those examples has actually happened over the last 2.5 years. We've found many bugs and other problems in virtually every area of the game that we can pull files from. Weapons, shields, armors, ships, uh, you name it. Right. So to me, an informed tester uh, is a better tester because we can look at these problems and directly help the developers make a better game. So starting from the homepage, starsystemdb.com, let's go to the bottom. And the first important question that players ask is, what version of the game is the data on the site from? And I always try to keep it updated to the current live version of the game. When there's a PTU out, sometimes they may push the PTU data just because when that happens, no one's really playing live anymore, and who cares, right? But sometimes it's a pain because I have to push it, unlike the nightly builds that they do. So keeping up to date can be challenging around that time. But anyway, if you're wondering what version it is, this is where you would find it. Uh, and if you want historical data on those older versions, it's not going to be on the site because I'm paying for hosting and all that stuff myself. But there are spreadsheets with all the historical stuff. And this is also where you would find a link to the spreadsheets. I always try to keep this um, up to the latest version. And just to kind of distinguish between when you would choose a site and when you would look at the spreadsheets. The spreadsheets are going to be like a quicker overview of a lot of stuff at once, a lot of things to compare. If you want more in-depth information about individual items and want to see graphs and links and all that other stuff, that's when you go to the site. So first, let's start with the spreadsheet since that's the quick and dirty stuff. The info page is this first tab here. It's going to tell you a lot of information, but I swear that no one ever reads it because every patch I get 50 questions about stuff that I already answer here. So the info tab is going to tell you that this is the current version for all the data in this particular spreadsheet. And for the older versions, it'll be in the same location. It's going to tell you that not every data point you read is necessarily accurate. Because certain parameters, the way the CIG does things, it gets complicated. And it's also going to tell you how to contact me if you need to do that. The second tab is also pretty important. Unlike the website, like I said earlier, I have records of every game version, so I started making this data public. So check the versions tab every time. I could click on an older version right now, and I bet there's people you know, still looking at outdated information. I found people looking at stuff 6 patches ago. It's kind of funny, but don't be that person, right? So for now, you can ignore the diff tab and just kind of take a general look at the layout of the rest of the tabs for the components. They're just listed alphabetically with the exception of the IFCS, the flight control system data, and the weapon data. Those are listed first because that's really what players want to see. So for the IFCS data, we have all the ships listed, including variants. variants will show you which base version they have. You'll notice some important columns here would be SCMs, velocity, so this is the top speed in space combat maneuvering mode, which is your general flight modes. Afterburner, your top speed at afterburner. These are also your max rotation rates, so the fastest that you can, roll, pitch, yaw. Jerk will tell you about acceleration in terms of, each direction that's listed. We also have the mass for every ship, and then we have the stop times. So I wouldn't really pay attention to anything to the right of the stop times. The stop times are where the developers kind of give an idea of how the ship should perform, how fast should it stop in any given direction, and that will determine things like the actual thrust values and all the scaling and stuff. So that's as far to the right in the spreadsheet as I would go for your average user. Just kind of focus on these ones, I think. In 261, we've gotten some interesting ships added to this, like the Aegis, the Javelin, and the handful of Vandal ships that you could see in Squadron 42. So that, I don't expect to be final in any way, shape, or form, but it gives us a little bit of an idea of how capital ships might perform in the end game. So then for components, let's start with weapons. This is arguably the most important component type that players are going to be looking at for their loadouts and comparing the best weapons. For most components, I start with the same columns in kind of the same order, just to be a little bit consistent. Local name is how the component is going to be represented in the UI on the website and places like that. Not every component is going to have a local name, even though all these weapons do. The devs actually have to put that into a language file, essentially, and that's going to be different depending on where you are. These are, of course, the English local names. So the item name itself is arguably more important. This is how the game recognizes the item and how it's kind of passed around between the different XMLs that they have. It's generally unique. So there are also some hidden columns here, and I only really show those columns when there's a difference between all the components on that tab. In this case, subtype is different for a handful of these weapons. You'll see nose mounted for the Gatling gun on the Avenger and the Gatling gun on the Gladius, and that's also why, or part of the reason why, those weapons are kind of uniquely locked to those ships. A lot of components now have manufacturer codes, excuse me. Pretty much every weapon is going to have a size, a mass, and a hit points value. One of the big things we were able to get from the devs in 260 was to increase these HP values from 100, and actually this one's still kind of an old, so they're 100 or 150. And basically that meant that you would have a weapon get blown off your ship, despite the fact that your shield was full and your hull was full health. From a single shot, you could lose a weapon, and they were kind enough to update that. The next few columns here are going to be around DPS values. So those aren't just kind of like calculated, those are actually simulated. So I basically run a script where I fire a shot and then I factor in cooling rate, how much heat that generates, how much power that requires, and I graph that out and actually put it in a table. So you can, it accounts for cooling, recharging, all that other stuff. So basically I run this, and then depending on how much damage I have over a certain rate of time, I just divide that, and that gives me the DPS. So the one that's most prominently displayed here is the 60-second one. Just because realistically in a dogfight, like a team versus team situation, that might be about how frequently you have to fire your gun, and gives you kind of a more realistic idea of how much damage you can put out. DPS no pipe. This is kind of what would happen if there were no restrictions on cooling and power for a weapon. So kind of a theoretical sustained DPS that isn't necessarily what you're going to see in reality. Next, you'll notice that the ammo name. So it used to be that there would be an ammo type like 30 millimeter ammo that could be assigned to multiple weapons. But recently, CIG has gone and assigned individual ammos to their respective weapon. So there's a unique ammo type for each weapon. And that's a little bit different than how it's been in the past. But that is important because the weapon, it's not the weapon that determines, like, for example, the range or the damage. That's actually the ammo. So the ammo has a lifetime and a speed, right? So the projectile velocity. Projectile velocity, of course, is also very important when you're selecting a weapon, because you want to have those pips as close as possible, which means you want to have weapons that are the same velocity. Anyway, those two things give you the maximum range of the ammo. And then you have your 3 ammo types. So in Star Citizen, there are 3 damage types. There's physical, energy, and distortion. So physical is like, ballistic damage. Energy is going to be from laser weapons and things like that. Distortion is kind of a more specialized type of damage that's supposed to, overwhelm pipe systems. I think it's mostly the energy pipe within ships, although that doesn't really seem to be fully functional yet. So as we skip through a couple of these other stats here, we get to spread. So spread is relatively new for a lot of weapons, and this is what's been a major factor in bringing fights to closer ranges. So now it's almost, even though I might have a pip show up at 2 kilometers, I'm almost never going to be killing something outside of 1 kilometer, even outside of 800 meters, because of the spread mostly, right? You're not going to be hitting a specific spot in the ship. You're going to be all over the place. And this is more pronounced in repeaters and fast firing weapons. But there's a weird value here, exceptionally high value for the mass drivers, the size 2 mass drivers. And that basically is going to be one of the reasons why those weapons are not very useful right now. Then we get to the pipe values, so power and heat. Before item 2.0, the cooler and power plant on your ships don't really have anything to do with cooling weapons. It's all set by the weapon themselves. They're all what I would say individually throttled. So there's no reason to upgrade power plant necessarily. You just want to have something equipped. And we expect that to change with item 2.0 and proper piping. But this will tell you, how long you can fire and how long it takes to, how long it takes to drain or overheat. And those are also pulled from the simulation data. It's not a simple calculation. So it's very realistic what you'll see here in terms of overheat time and drain time. And then the last column here that I would point out is the default loadout. So this is going to be what ships come equipped with that weapon by default. This is really useful if you want to rent a ship or you're looking for a specific weapon and then you want to find a ship you can rent to get it. So these are ordered by, they're grouped by size and then kind of sorted by the 60-second DPS. There are a lot of test components that I filter out. There's a lot of test weapons of, I think that CIG is experimenting with or kind of figuring out. I'm not sure if this is one of those or if this is the railgun on the Idris. I haven't really looked that deeply into that. But anyway, I take all those out because they would just clutter it. But anyway, this is how you can kind of evaluate weapons. And so what I would say here is, if you're seeing a size 1 weapon that has such low DPS, you might also want to look at the rate of fire and the the velocity and things like that. But you can kind of say that, okay, the omnis in pretty much every category, actually it doesn't even exist in the game yet, but are overly weak. And you can say, well, what's the best size 2? This is obviously locked to the Vanguard, but you would say, okay, the Badger. And that's how you would do that. This is also, you can kind of get an idea of how gimbaled versus fixed weapons are going to behave. A lot of the ships like the Saber and the Super Hornet, for gimbal loadouts, have a size 2. For a fixed loadout, are going to have a size 3. So if there's not a big enough gap between these sizes, that's when you start to see issues with controller parity. Now we've been trying to have this idea going of removing the size drop so that a fixed size 3 mount will have can be gimbaled at size 3 too, instead of having the size penalty. You would instead have a straight percentage DPS loss or something like that. That'd be a lot easier to keep balance between patches. You wouldn't have to worry about the difference between sizes. You wouldn't have to worry about the fact that size 1's hardpoints can't be gimbaled, or that default loadouts can't work with control schemes. It would be a much cleaner way to do it. So let's move on. All right, so let's look at ammo box here, which is pretty simple in terms of components. Basically it's going to have how many of whatever ammo you can hold. This is where you'll see the difference between flares in ships and things like that, and also the various ballistic weapons. Armor is a little bit more interesting. every ship in the game actually has an armor assigned to it, even though only 7 of those armor values have actually been filled out. Everything else has been pretty much left. So there's a lot of improvements that, for example, CIG could make by giving the Saber some signature reducing stuff, or giving the Vanguard armor or whatever, right? I would like to see these filled out just so that it's not so big of a gap between something like the Super Hornet, which actually has armor values, and the Gladius, which has nothing. It's making that gap even bigger unnecessarily. So let's talk about how this works really quick. Absorption is going to say how much of that type of damage, physical energy or distortion, is going to be absorbed. So this will absorb 65%. Right? If you shoot 100 damage projectile on it, you'll take 65 damage, and then the other 35% will be mitigated. That's essentially how that works. For example, and it also is going to, absorb or mitigate 5% of energy damage. Excuse me, and that goes for the distortion too. For the signature multipliers, it's kind of a straight multiplier. So if you have a component generating, or I should say your a component, it's maybe easier to understand for heat and power. If it's generating 1 point of power, it will generate 1 signature. When you have a mitigation, so for example, a stealth ship like the Hornet, 1 energy point is going to only show up as 0.5 signature values. So that's armor. So for avionics, let's skip to the site really quick to look at these. The key component here is the motherboard, just like a normal computer, like a home computer. During the Q&A for the Hurricane, the devs were talking about targeting computers and pilot control of turrets. This is what they're talking about. The motherboard has these upgrade slots. It also seems to hold your quantum drive and your quantum fuel tank. But basically, what you would do is you slot in, different upgrade slots for things you would want, like for example, a remote controlled turret from your ship. And this is all based also on CPU. Now, I don't put these in the spreadsheet because the values are all the same, so it doesn't really matter for them. But if we go to, do I have targeting computers here? Yeah, so targeting computers. There are some differences here. This is basically, how many ships you can target, and this is, people were talking about the Willops targeting system in the 325A. This is kind of what they were saying. That's how you could pin multiple targets and lock more missiles on multiple ships. That's what allows you to do that. So yeah, the crew drive is quantum drive. This is the actual speed that you're traveling with. I just listed this table because that's an interesting factoid. CM stands for countermeasures. You'll be able to see here what flare does and what chaff does. It doesn't really make much sense, but CIG has kind of made the decision that chaff is going to work against EM. Chaff is supposed to be for radar, right? And in reality, that's cross section. Radar is what detects cross section. And there were previous patches where there wasn't any signature disruption at all for CS missiles. Like this value was literally 0. It was for both of these, right? And that's why, that was a complete disaster in terms of missiles not being able to be evaded. And that was another thing we were able to help with. So I don't know what the plans are for this. I don't know if they're going to have more countermeasure types, but right now it's just flare and chaff. So let's look at coolers. Again, piping doesn't really matter at the moment. I expect that to change with item 2.0. And when that does, it's useful to know that cooling is actually a derived stat between the amount of power that it uses per second and the heat to power ratio. So that's not actually in the game files. I have to come up with this. So this is what you would look for really. But it's also important to say how efficient it is. One thing I forgot to mention earlier was sizes. So with weapons, you're going to have size 1 through, I think they might even be going up to 12. And it's kind of a gradual increase. With pretty much every other component, there's going to be 4 sizes. So I believe it's small, medium, large, and capital ship. And essentially, it's an increase in 4 at each size increase. So the old size 3s would be 3 smalls, so 3 size 1s. The old size 4 would be a size 2, and so on. And that's that's why there's such a big gap between a size 1 and a size 2 now. And actually, why there's so few size 2s is because most things are still in the size 1 small category, I should say. So we can talk about fuel intakes. Again, not something you can really change at the moment, but this is basically for boost. Same thing with the fuel tank. This is how much boost capacity that you can have in your ship. And oddly, there's a recharge rate here and an intake rate here. I don't know how those necessarily interact. But again, you can't really modify it. It doesn't matter. Quantum fuel tank. These are what's going to allow your ship to quantum drive around. How often you can do that, or how long you can do that. These are all in millions. And you kind of get an idea of what they consider a shorter range ship, and then the longer range ships. Guns. This is actually FPS weapons. So this is a newer thing. It's kind of important to realize that although I have the weapon values, they're pretty much just like the ship weapon values. I don't have the armor values for things like the medium armor, light armor, and so on. Those are kind of disappeared from the game files, and I don't know where they are, and I can't seem to find them. But if you, because it's a CryEngine game, or maybe not because of that, but there's a lot of information about FPS weapons and guns that other ship weapons don't actually have, like the drop. I listed out the fire modes here, and then from this point forward, you're going to see, for example, the default fire modes, spread, kick, how much it pulls, all these I would consider advanced attributes. And then I think I have like, there's like the single, how much for the burst rate or the burst mode, and that kind of stuff. So that's fairly advanced for FPS weapons. And they do have kind of the same situation where they have an ammo, and the ammo determines the actual range and the damage. So we can move on to missiles. They've had a more recent overhaul, and I especially like how it's nice and clean, and for each size they have kind of at least three. But you can see the range. Now this is actually calculated by the more advanced IFCS values that missiles have gotten. So there's like an acceleration and ignition time and all these other values that are more advanced, tell you how fast the missile can turn, how long it can lock, and all these other things. I don't really think that the Rattler is correctly adding. I forget actually. Missile rack, again, to go along with the missile change, missile racks were overhauled into this really beautiful format where it's kind of the size of the mount, the number of the missiles, and the size of those missiles. And I wish this kind of consistent naming scheme existed across weapons. Like the 117 is a size 2, the M4A is a size 2. Well, why would they do that? No engineer would do that. It must be marketing. But anyway, the racks are really clearly tell you how many missiles and what size that they can hold. Not much more advanced than that. Moving on to power, again, like cooling, power doesn't matter that much. Eventually you'll want to see, how much power that is going to generate. You also want to consider how much heat that's going to generate. So this is what I was talking about earlier about signature multipliers. For every, point of energy, this was going to create one IR signature point, but 1.25. So even though this generates, more energy, it might be worse than a more efficient or stealthier power plant. Radar list, they just recently started to implement different ones. So the only difference right now is range. And you can see which ship of each type has that radar. I list seat, but I don't think this is necessarily important. I thought it had something to do with like G-forces and things. Probably worth ignoring. Self-destruct, the only interesting thing really is the timer. So how long each ship has to self-destruct. Shield is an interesting thing once we can change them again. They've been locked out for a long time now, but previously you could rearrange shields between ships and things like that. Again, same, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not listed here, but the 4 types or the 4 sizes for shields. One interesting thing to note here is that even though it might have a higher total shield, if it's split in the 4 faces, in my opinion at least, it's actually worse because you're less likely to be using all of those points before you start taking damage. So the ideal situation actually is to have a single face so that you're never wasting a point of damage, right? Like it doesn't matter if my right wing is fully shielded if my cockpit is getting hit. So if there's unless it's substantially higher, it's almost better to go with the lower number of faces. And I think they're actually changing this so that it's the face type is determined by the ship itself, and that just kind of um, deploys the shields. This is another place you can see mitigation based on the 3 damage types, so absorption. What you'll see by a higher multiplier is that it's actually absorbing more damage, right? So if you get hit by 1 point of damage, you're going to lose 1.3 shields. For ballistics, you can see that how much they penetrate. It's very similar to armor. If it's absorbing 0.4 damage from a ballistic round, that means 0.6 is getting through. And ballistic shield pen has been kind of a personal issue of mine for the longest time. It kind of means that it doesn't matter if you have full shields up, you can start taking damage immediately, and that just means you're going to get worn down. It kind of makes shields irrelevant. So for thrusters, I have the main thrusters on the back of the ship, separate from the navigation or maneuvering thrusters. You can't really modify these, and they're not necessarily important to look at. But it might be interesting to see how much I don't know why this special character is showing up, but this is degrees per second. Turrets are kind of cool. Again, you can see the angle, the speed, and how far they can go. A lot of people will say, well, let's slow down, game mode mounts. Well, a lot of them are pretty slow, so it doesn't go up necessarily to size 6 in actual game right now, but 5 degrees a second is relatively slow. Countermeasure launchers, not super interesting. Pretty standard. And again, weapon EMP only on one ship, but you can see how long the range is and how long it takes to actually release it. So that's just a quick overview of the information available on the spreadsheets. I did go over that kind of quickly. I could go into these more in depth, but I feel like they're constantly changing and there's a lot of flux. So there's nothing wrong with people doing videos on like what's the best shield right now or the best weapon, but just keep in mind that's constantly changing. So it's better to teach you guys how to read the spreadsheets, and so you can kind of figure that out as they change, patch over patch. So now let's go back to the website really quick here, on the homepage. Again, like I said earlier, this is for the more in-depth view. I'm able to, on a website, do a lot of things that I can't do in a spreadsheet, like have images and have links. You can kind of do that in a spreadsheet, but the Google Sheets API doesn't let you do that. So everything is automated, so I just upload everything to the sheets with a single touch of the button, which means I can't really add links and pictures there. So that's really one of the main reasons why I created the page, this website, excuse me. So you can navigate to individual ships and components via the drop-down menu. For convenience sake, I added a lot of the category links for components and the individual ships like right off the front page. You can go straight into them. Let's take a look really quick at ships first. Keep in mind that there are a lot of ships here that are base ships. So I think the Cutlass Black might be one, the Freelancer. They're in the game files, but they don't really have values assigned to them. What you need to do actually is look at the base or the specific variant, and that's going to give you the actual values fit out. So if you see a ship with nothing in it, that's why. It's just a placeholder or an older version or whatever, but it's not what you want to be looking at. So let's go to the variant. Again, you can kind of see things like the description written out a little bit nicer. Information is presented in a very dense, kind of compact way, so you can see it all at once for an individual ship. I'm also able to, display stuff that I wouldn't really be able to do in a spreadsheet with kind of like this nested format. So you can see all the default equipment that comes on this ship. And for example, we talked about avionics earlier. You can see what goes in those slots by default. And so there's not really any room left in this ship. One thing that I haven't gotten around to yet is better breaking out of like the hardpoint sizes. So for example, you can say, well, it's got a wing slot that is size 3, or and another wing slot that's size 3, and a turret slot, whatever. That's just because of how messy the data is. So I just listed the raw information here, but I don't really expect anyone to use this, and really, unless they really want to get into it. But it's going to show you what the port name is, the hard point size, and then like what you can put in there, like the size. But I'm going to try to clean this up. It's just that there's very little consistency between chips, and it's hard to script that. Um, but again, this is available for every ship right now, and it's kind of cool to see what's on there by default, and to be able to just click on it and go to that item. So weapons, yeah, you can either click through that, or go to weapons, and then select by size. I showed you this chart earlier, the simulation chart. Again, all the data is displayed in a neat format here per weapon. I do have, let's look at missiles, like the tables, but it's definitely less capable and pretty than the actual spreadsheets. Although I do have the link here, so you could, if you really wanted to, I can only sort by one thing at a time right now, but you can click right on something and go to it. So for weapons, there's a couple, and a couple other ways to compare them. So let's say you wanted to look at items side by side, kind of narrow it down to a handful of them anyway. You just take the item name, actually, so it's the homepage / compare, and then the item name separated with an and. So again, the item name is this more technical looking one with the underscores, and not the local name. And that's going to let you kind of do this comparison. And only do that between components of the same type. So only for, go back, and if you want to see that same information in the graphs, that is the /sim, and then you set the time, and then again, the individual items separated by ampersands there. And that's just going to give you a visual representation of how they perform over 60 seconds. And you can see kind of the changes in the slopes of the weapons is going to be where they hit their their energy cap, or their heat cap. So yeah, keep in mind that there's some other features that I'd like to add. It's definitely kind of a work in progress that I'm just doing on my own. So don't necessarily expect a ton of stuff. I'm updating it whenever I get free time. So I think that about covers it for the website. Oh yeah, actually no, it doesn't. There is basically what I do is I convert the raw XML files in the game files into JSON, because it's a lot cooler than XML, a lot more up to date. So what you can do is go in here and actually see, I guess it's not necessarily the raw data because I've already put it in JSON, but this is where the information is pulled from. So if there's something you have a question about, like does a certain weapon actually have that value, you can go in here and look at the pretty much the raw values. This is more or less how they're kind of defined in the game files. I just strip out a lot of the stuff that we don't really need. But that's the /API URL path. And yeah, it's kind of a pain to kind of click through these things. This is how CIG categorizes things. So it's, a weapon is a vehicle weapon, weapon gun, and then the subtypes. So it's, it's somewhat complicated. I have characters in here, but this isn't really fully fleshed out. And it helps to have a JSON formatter in your browser. So I think that's all I really wanted to cover today. It was kind of a long video. If there's any more information or any in-depth questions or anything that you have, feel free to ask me. Also ask me, a lot of people want to host this data or modify it or whatever on their own sites. That's okay, as long as you kind of ask me. I just would recommend, I will recommend, if possible, that you kind of download the spreadsheets as a CSV or whatever, and put them in your database so that you don't have to constantly query my API or something like that. So yeah, I guess there's, I guess thanks to a couple people, Toys R Me kind of tipped me off to the whole extracting the game files in the first place. And there's Didi, Tazius, DeVito, do a lot of work with kind of taking this data or even getting their own data and putting up some informative spreadsheets about um, difference in IFCS value or hit points and things like that. Bayer also deserves some gratitude for helping me figure out, XYZ movements and how those actually corresponded to IFCS values. And the biggest thanks is for Aluron, who is basically allows this whole thing to happen by keeping up to date with the extraction tools as CIG kind of deviates further and further away from the original CryEngine format. So he's really enabling me to do all this because otherwise I wouldn't be able to get the game files into plain text. Like I said, I do all this work myself, pay for everything myself. There's no ads. I'm not really asking for money or anything. Just whenever the situation comes, um, I, I would just like support from people to have CIG keep all this data available to players and open. And it's really a big help when we go to test and solve problems and kind of figure out uh, you know where the game is going and all that other stuff. So thanks a lot. Hopefully this wasn't too long, but I mean if you're listening to this video, that's your own fault. So thanks. I'll see you guys later.